Oh shit! Robocop! Robocop is so fucking great. A perfect blend of action, hyperviolence, satire, humor, and sincere human emotions. But I don't have to tell you this. You've seen it. Or you haven't seen it. Nah, you've seen it. I like it! Kickstarting Paul Verhoeven's holy trinity of American sci-fi masterpieces that make you yearn for a time that violent action films could be subtle and substantive. Fucking Total Recall, Robocop, Starship Troopers, all great. There are plenty of great in-depth looks at what make 1987's Robocop a very special movie. But in typical Alpha Rookie fashion, we're here to take a look at what Robocop's impact was on the world of comic books. With a title that was intentionally comic booky, Robocop knows what kind of genre material it's trading in. Here's some of it here. Not an accident. And some more of it here. Also not an accident. The Robocop license has changed hands 3 times between 4 different publishers, beginning with Marvel in 1990. These days, when people think of Marvel, they think of the Avengers, Spider-Man, X-Men, etc. In other words, the Marvel Universe. However, through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, Marvel Comics published a whole slew of comics based on cartoons, movies, and toys, including The Wizard of Oz, Indiana Jones, G.I. Joe, Doctor Who, Transformers, Ghostbusters, Barbie, and Power Rangers. They also published Star Wars comics for about 9 years, starting in 1977, before they reobtained the license last year. Similar to the Star Wars comics, Marvel started with adapting the first Robocop film, then extrapolated from there. What can I say here? Robocop the movie is a rated R masterpiece. So, a masterpiece, if you will. And Marvel Comics are selling books to kids.
Robocop and the Ultra Police, the only cops with rapid repeat cap firing.
From there, the license moved to Dark Horse in 1992. Dark Horse produced several miniseries during their time with the property, including Robocop vs. Terminator, which might be the all-time greatest crossover comic ever. More on that later. Next stop is a brief stint at Avatar Press, mostly comprised of a comic book adaptation of Frank Miller's original screenplay for the Robocop film sequel. More on this later as well. Dynamite, license, publish, 2010. No. Don't read.
No.
All right, moving on. That leads us to now at Boom Studios, where, to the best of my knowledge, the Robocop license still resides. At least until someone tries to reboot the movies again. Probably. Yeah, don't do that again. Okay, so, you're obviously totally welcome to read all of this stuff if you want to be thorough, but, in my opinion, if you only have time for the really interesting material, you gotta go with the Frank Miller stuff. If you don't know who Frank Miller is, unfortunately, this is not the video where I get you up to speed. The dude's career could fill a documentary on its own, and there are plenty of resources all over the internet to fit the bill. Suffice to say, among other things, he wrote and drew The Dark Knight Returns, the comic that turned the industry on its head, for better or for worse, and became the end-all be-all for Hollywood Batman productions, especially the Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice movie. But I'm specifically here to talk about Frank Miller and Robocop, and what I think is a match made in 80s cyborg heaven. As I said, DC published Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns in 1986, the same year they published Watchmen. Both very much books that captured the zeitgeist of the era. Robocop comes out in 1987, 1 year later. Now, I'm not trying to say the Robocop screenwriters were inspired by Dark Knight Returns or anything like that. I'll be damned if they don't have a lot in common.
Okay, Miller, don't hurt the mayor.
In addition to being badass action stories,
No, that dude is badass! I've never seen anything as badass as that!
both Robocop and DKR are satires. They are often satirizing the same subjects and using the same modes of satire. They both take place in dystopic urban environments reflecting the high crime rates and threat of Cold War casting a shadow over the mid-80s. They are both successful at simultaneously satirizing violence while at the same time providing a cathartic fantasy for cutting through all the bureaucratic bullshit. And just for shits and giggles, Peter Weller, Robocop himself, voiced Batman in the animated version of Dark Knight Returns.
You will rely on your brains and your fists. Tonight, I am the law.
Again, not saying the one inspired the other, just saying that if the Robocop creators ever read DKR, they probably loved it. And Frank Miller sure as shit loved Robocop when he saw it. And you know who also liked Robocop? David Lynch. Do you know how I know this? Because he casted 3 of the actors in Robocop in Twin Peaks. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. Twin Peaks 2017. Of course, it was only a matter of time before Frank Miller was approached to write Robocop 2. The story has been mined to death, but here's the short version. Boy writes an amazing comic book that's very in line with the Robocop franchise. Boy meets Hollywood. Boy loves movies, and so of course he's going to walk into this Hollywood reality check buzzsaw with his eyes closed. The boy's script is written with all the unbridled imagination and zeal of a comic book writer, and so of course the studio deems it unfilmable. The boy's eyes are wide open now, and they are absent of stars. And finally, the boy retreats back to comics where you can do whatever the fuck you want. All that, except Miller was a grown-ass man at the time, of course. But Miller was not quite done with Robocop. In 1992, Dark Horse was definitely versed in the two great tastes that taste great together style of publishing, and so it's no surprise that we ended up with a Robocop vs. Terminator miniseries, and Frank Miller would get an opportunity to tell a Robocop story on his terms. Okay, I'm going to call it. Robocop vs. Terminator, the best comic book licensed crossover ever. Come at me, internet. But seriously, with a team like Miller and Walter Simonson, how could you expect anything different? Who's Walter Simonson, you might ask? He is probably best known for his run on the Marvel character Thor. And outside of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who created him, he is the artist most associated with the wielder of Mjolnir. He also drew the comic book version of Alien for Heavy Metal, and a bunch of other stuff. He's a sick artist, and the nicest guy you'll ever meet. So, the book. Robocop vs. Terminator is a Robocop story at heart. There's no Connors or Reeses or Arnolds. The book revolves around the idea that the Robocop project leads to the creation of Skynet, and so in time travel terms, if Alex Murphy is taken out of the timeline, Judgment Day is avoided. This allows for a really neat reversal, where instead of a Terminator sent back in time to kill a human is sent back in time to kill a cyborg, and Terminators are sent back in time to protect that cyborg. This is very much in the tradition of T2 Judgment Day, where a Terminator is also sent back to protect a human. And from Sarah Connor's perspective, Arnold is still the bad guy. She doesn't know that he's actually there to help her until he says,
"Come with me if you want to live."
It's okay, Mom. He's here to help. It's okay.
This kind of playful reversal is prevalent throughout the book, and begins with the opening scene in the future, where the vestiges of mankind fight the Skynet robot army. The first caption reads, "Peace will come. This is the last battle." Naturally, as a reader, you assume this is the first-person narrative of a human resistance fighter. But then the next caption reads, "These desperate, sweating things, these humans, are almost gone," giving us the unique perspective of the Terminators. Speaking of playfulness, the book is funny, which is a must if you're going to tell a Robocop story, something the new film just completely whiffed on. I love that this book understands that ED-209 is a joke and uses them to hilarious effect. Or something like this, where we have this guy with a bomb strapped to his chest, warning Robocop he's rigged to blow in just a few seconds. So, Robocop just throws him as far as he can off the fucking roof. Pretty funny. And it's a comic book, which means Miller and Simonson can stretch these characters well beyond their practical elements. Murphy, part man and part machine, can become a cyberpunk walking computer interface that can hack into Skynet with powers in the digital realm, or become a human fighter jet. Oh yeah, and I like these subtle nods back to The Dark Knight Returns, like this panel. And the original comic and collections had these little character cutout stand-ups, which is pretty cool. While Robocop vs. Terminator is mostly considered a classic, and is not something I have to sweat too much while I'm talking it up, the next book is a little bit more of a hot take. So remember the whole Frank Miller boy meets Hollywood story? In 2003, Avatar Press published a comic book adaptation of Frank Miller's original screenplay for Robocop 2, in an attempt to bring Miller's vision for the movie to the visual medium of comic books. Stephen Grant adapted the screenplay with art by Juan Jose Rip. The whole thing came out to 9 oversized issues. So why is this a hot take? I believe the general reaction to this book has been that it's trashy, ugly, a mean-spirited comic and worthy of the crazy asshole status people have since relegated Frank Miller to. The thing is, that's why I like it. Also, while we're doing hot takes, I also really like Robocop 2. Yes, that actual much-maligned movie. Is it a step down from the first? Of course. But I feel like there's some interesting ideas, humor, and even a good dose of sincere pathos. quite a bit of it coming from Frank Miller's script, including Robocop getting loaded down with too many directives, making him a gentrified after-school special, and the presenting Robocop scene that Favreau liked well enough to repurpose for Iron Man 2. You've got this scene here where his handlers are convincing Murphy to stop checking on his wife, and Peter Weller is just so fucking sad. Poor Murphy.
No.
You've got some of the best stop-motion work I've ever seen, co-created by Hollywood legend Phil Tippett. And even though Polydorus didn't return to score the sequel, Leonard Rosenman's original score turned out great. It's catchy, and a choir even sings the title of the movie. Robocop! Robocop! What I like most of all, though, and if I'm being honest, this reaction has a lot to do with what they did with the remake. With Robocop 2, they at least tried to replicate the R-rated action satire from the first film. It doesn't always work, but they get an A for effort. Okay, back to the book. As R-rated as the movie was, and looking at Miller's original script, you can understand why the studio said it was unfilmable. Just as an example, Frank Miller's version of Robocop 2 has OCP tearing down tenement buildings while poor people are still living inside, without enough time to get out. The destruction separates families, leaving children on the street, and since the Detroit Police Department is on strike, it leaves roving bands of child slavers free to snatch kids off the street and sell them on the black market. Speaking of black markets, Frank Miller even has the slavers discussing how it's too difficult to move the black kids. Yeah, that's totally in the comic, and totally not in a studio-produced, high-profile feature film. If that's any indication as to where Miller's thought process was compared to how Hollywood operates, it's no wonder they weren't on the same page. And that's just in the first 15 minutes of the movie. It really makes me wonder how many execs even finished reading the entire script. And all that, somehow, got turned into a comic book. Anything can happen in comic books. All you need is your imagination.
Imagination.
There are a few things to keep in mind when approaching this comic. Even though this was drawn in the 2000s, it was written in the late 80s, so take some of the dialogue with a grain of contextual salt. Also, this adaptation was published by Avatar, who is notorious for specializing in exploitation. They put out the goriest and most fan-servicey books on the market, including Crossed, which has people bludgeoned to death with giant floppy horse cocks. So while the first Robocop movie was certainly not shy about violence, it wasn't overtly sexual, and so you might be taken back by how much TNA there is in the comic. Some of it for satirical value, and some of it for its own sake. Add to that the artist Juan Jose Rip, a Spanish artist known for his work in erotic comics, and you get the picture. I like Juan Jose Rip. A lot. And I suspect that his other fans like him for the same reason I do. He reminds us a lot of Jeff Darrow, who just so happened to collaborate with Frank Miller twice on Hard Boiled and Big Guy and Rusted the Robot. Film has an advantage when communicating movement and action. What a film can communicate in 1 second may take a comic multiple panels to get across. So when you're adapting a screenplay, your comic is probably going to be pretty dense with panels. Couple that with Rip's artwork, which is dense with detail to begin with, and sometimes reading the book can be a dizzying experience. But if you take it slow and accept that this comic is luxuriating in ugliness, you'll at least begin to appreciate what it's doing visually. Alright, I think I've addressed the trashy and ugly aspects of the book. Let's talk about the mean-spirited aspect, because it totally is, and I'm totally into it. One of the most frustrating things about certain Frank Miller fans is why they love some of his work. They love it because it's cool and badass.
Badass, 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 badass.
And make no mistake, very often it is cool and badass. But in addition to those things, Frank Miller is also way into pitch black comedy. And yes, that includes the almighty Dark Knight Returns. Okay, I'm about to ruin this book for some of you, and I don't mean spoilers. Look at this powerful sequence. You remember it. This is the night Bruce Wayne gives in to that inner need to don the cape and cowl again after not being able to find anything good on the television. The panels cut between him, the TV, and the memory of his parents' murder. As Miller increases the intensity between Bruce, the TV, and the memory, he pulls our focus to Martha's pearl necklace and abstracts it on the following page. So we are now cutting between brief clips of news anchors reporting violent deaths, Bruce with his strained expression, and what of course still looks like a close-up of a pearl necklace breaking apart, but what now also could be construed as...
Oh, you know what I'm talking about.
Add to this the actual crude double meaning of pearl necklace, and this whole sequence has a completely new context. What does it mean? What does it say about Batman? What does it say about justice and vengeance? Frank Miller is a goddamn genius. This is why I didn't like the Dark Knight Returns animated films. They left in all the cool and the badass, but left out all the dark humor. And the bat jizz. Anyway, Miller's Robocop 2 script is no exception. It is bleak, darkly comical, scathingly satirical of modern media, fascism in the guise of progressive liberalism, the all-consuming, morally devoid final endgame of corporations, and the militarization of the police. It pulls no punches and is not interested in subtlety. So if it comes off as mean-spirited, it's only because it's so angry. And anger is as worthy an emotion to work with as any. However, there is a heart buried under all that angry satire. While the first Robocop was about Alex Murphy rediscovering his humanity, Frank Miller's Robocop 2 is about retaining that humanity by refusing to be OCP's slave. His struggle feels genuine. It is at times funny and touching, but it's always endearing overall. There should be trades out there for both the Robocop vs. Terminator and Robocop 2 series, which is sometimes referred to as Frank Miller's Robocop, for relatively cheap. Since the 2003 Avatar series, Boom has published some other stuff, including another comic book adaptation of one of Frank Miller's screenplays, this time of his Robocop 3 script. They did some stuff tying into the remake, and some new stuff taking place in the original movie universe that's decent. As much as I like talking about Robocop, I had a really good time talking about Frank Miller. His personality, career, and his audience are a fascinating topic. For me, he was a natural beacon when I began to get into comics, but like many others, I began to think the Emperor had no clothes. However, in recent years, I've begun to take a more nuanced look at this guy and what he's done. The only thing that I can say for sure is that none of it is by accident. And it's no accident that these Robocop comics are seriously worth your time.